We live in a time where technology changes every few years, but for most of human history, things barely changed at all. People lived and died using the exact same tools their great-great-grandparents used. Civilizations persisted for thousands of years without meaningful advancement. But here is the thing. Those people were not less intelligent than us. Every idea we consider obvious today had to be invented by somebody. The genius who figured out how to put a hole in a bone and pull thread through it was the Einstein of their generation. We're not smart in isolation. We're standing on a mountain of knowledge passed down through thousands of generations. 100,000 years ago, our species already looked exactly like us. Same faces, same bodies, same brains, but they did not behave the same way. Scientists call this the difference between anatomically modern and behaviorally modern, and around 100,000 years ago something started to shift. New behaviors appeared, new technologies emerged, something was changing in how humans engaged with the world. If you enjoy this, hit subscribe and drop where you're watching from. Some of the earliest clear evidence for these behaviorally modern humans comes from a cave perched on the southern coast of Africa. Blombos Cave in South Africa has yielded discoveries that fundamentally reshaped our understanding of early human capabilities. Here, complex technology and various forms of artistic expression have been found together in layers dating back 100,000 years. The people living in this cave were doing things that researchers previously assumed only appeared much later in human history. First and foremost, these early humans were manufacturing exceptional stone points. These spearheads or knives were crafted through a sophisticated three-phase process. The maker would start by using a hard hammer, probably a rock to rough out the basic shape from a larger stone core. Next, they would switch to a softer hammer, perhaps fashioned from bone or antler, and use it to remove thinner, more controlled flakes. Finally, they employed a technique called pressure flaking, where they would take a pointed tool made of antler or horn and press it directly against the edge of the stone to push off tiny, precise flakes. This last technique is particularly significant. Pressure flaking allows a craftsperson extraordinary control over the final shape and sharpness of a tool. Until the discoveries at Blombos Cave, the earliest known evidence for pressure flaking came from Europe roughly 20,000 years ago. These African toolmakers were using the technique 50,000 years before it became common elsewhere in the world. They were genuinely ahead of their time in ways that still astonish researchers. But there is more to these points than technical sophistication. Some of them were heat-treated before being shaped. By placing certain types of stone in the heart of a hot fire, toolmakers could change its internal structure, making it more brittle and easier to flake with precision. This represents yet another layer of technical knowledge. These people understood that fire could transform the properties of stone itself. The heat treatment evidence at Blombos is among the earliest in the archaeological record. Perhaps most intriguing is that these stone points may have carried meaning beyond their practical function. Researchers have noticed that the points were made considerably finer than they needed to be for hunting. The makers were rejecting partially finished pieces that would have worked perfectly well as tools apparently because they did not meet some aesthetic standard. Some points appear to have been deliberately left behind in rock shelters rather than carried away for use. This suggests they held symbolic or social value beyond their utility as weapons. Points of this craftsmanship would not appear elsewhere in the world until the Solutrean culture emerged in Europe tens of thousands of years later. Those European toolmakers almost certainly created impractically thin and refined points specifically to demonstrate their mastery of the craft. The people at Blombos may have been doing something similar 100,000 years ago. Beyond the stone tools, elaborate bone implements have also been found at this remarkable site. Bone awls, bone points, and even an engraved bone artifact demonstrate that these early humans were working with a variety of materials using techniques that would not become common worldwide for another 50,000 years. The technological sophistication is remarkable, but there is still much more to discover within this cave. Multiple forms of what can only be called art have emerged from Blombos. A small stone flake bearing 9 red lines drawn deliberately across its surface dates to 73,000 years ago. While not quite 100,000 years old, this represents the oldest drawing ever discovered anywhere in the world. The red lines were made with ochre, an iron-rich earth pigment that shows up repeatedly throughout human prehistory. More than 8,000 pieces of ochre have been recovered from the cave. Many of these pieces were clearly scraped or ground down to produce powder for use as pigment. Some bear intricate geometric patterns carefully engraved into their surfaces, representing some of the oldest rock art ever found. Alongside these engraved pieces, archaeologists discovered 2 complete ochre processing toolkits. Each kit consisted of a large abalone shell filled with crushed ochre charcoal and fragments of mammal bone. A grinding stone placed on top of each shell showed evidence of pounding and mixing the materials together. The bone fat and other ingredients would have combined with the ochre powder to create a thick paste. What was this paste used for? Researchers believe it may have been applied to human bodies as decoration, perhaps during symbolic rituals or ceremonies. This interpretation might seem like a stretch, but the sophistication of these toolkits strongly suggests the ochre served purposes beyond simple survival needs. Red ochre has been used by humans going back hundreds of thousands of years, and its use continues in various cultures to this day. The Blombos kits represent one of the clearest and earliest examples of intentional pigment production for what appears to be symbolic purposes. Other remains from this extraordinary cave include shell beads. Personal ornaments like beads appear throughout many ancient human cultures and are considered important markers of complex social organization. The presence of these beads suggests that the inhabitants of Blombos Cave were communicating social status or group identity through personal adornment. They were not just surviving, they were signaling to each other in sophisticated symbolic ways. The variety of animal remains found within the cave paints a picture of people who had mastered their environment. Aquatic creatures, including various fish, shellfish, seals, and even dolphins, were brought back to the cave and consumed. On land, these hunters took down large game as well as smaller mammals and tortoises. The sheer diversity of their diet suggests they had developed many different specialized techniques for obtaining food from both sea and land. The findings at Blombos Cave have been instrumental in reshaping our understanding of this early period in human evolution. But Blombos is far from the only site revealing advanced behaviors in Africa during this time. Along the Semliki River in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, multiple complex bone harpoons have been found dating to around 90,000 years ago. These were not crude implements. They were large, robust, and featured multiple barbs along their shafts with grooves carved into them for hafting. Researchers believe they were designed to spear giant catfish, some of which could weigh as much as 68 kilograms. A single fish of that size could feed a community for 2 days. The site is littered with the bones of thousands of catfish, strongly suggesting that fishing was a central part of life for these people. Eastern and northern Africa experienced much wetter conditions during this period, with more extensive lakes and rivers than exist today. This may have allowed for the development of widespread fishing cultures across the region. These were not random innovations. They were systematic adaptations that demonstrate genuine sophistication. Moving east, we find evidence that touches something even more personal than technology or food gathering. At a site in Kenya called Pangaya Saidi, archaeologists uncovered what appears to be one of the oldest human burials in Africa. A child around 2.5 to 3 years old was carefully placed in a small pit beneath the sheltered overhang of a cave some 78,000 years ago. The researchers nicknamed this child Mtoto, meaning child in Swahili. The way the remains were positioned tells a story of intentional care. The child had been laid on their side with legs curled up in what resembles a sleeping position. Chemical analysis of the surrounding soil strongly suggests this was no accidental burial. The body appears to have been wrapped in some kind of shroud, and a pillow or cushion may have supported the head. This is not how remains end up when they are simply abandoned. Someone placed this child here with tenderness and deliberation. This find represents the earliest clear evidence of burial behavior among our species in Africa. Neanderthals in Europe and the Middle East may have been burying their dead even earlier, but this is the oldest example we have of our own ancestors engaging in what can only be described as mortuary ritual. The people who buried Mtoto experienced grief. They wanted to care for their dead even after death. That speaks to an emotional and perhaps spiritual complexity that transcends mere survival. These discoveries from across Africa paint a picture of a continent where human ingenuity was flourishing 100,000 years ago. From the master craftspeople of Blombos cave to the fishermen of the Semliki River to the grieving community at Pangaya Saidi, our ancestors were developing the complex behaviours that would eventually spread across the entire planet. But Africa was not the only place where remarkable things were happening, and our species was not alone on this earth. Even at this early date, humans were beginning to venture beyond the African continent. Our species had started appearing in the Middle East, representing the first tenuous steps of what would become a global migration. The oldest unquestionable Homo sapiens fossil found outside of Africa is a jawbone from Israel dating to 190,000 years ago. Over the following tens of thousands of years, our species radiated through parts of this region, encountering something extraordinary. Other kinds of humans. The Middle East during this period was a crossroads of human diversity unlike anything that exists today. Neanderthals had ranged into this area from Europe. Their populations extended all across the region, living in the same caves and valleys that would later host our own ancestors. But recent discoveries suggest the picture was even more complex than anyone had imagined. At a site in Israel, researchers uncovered skull and jaw fragments that do not quite match either Neanderthals or Homo sapiens. These mysterious remains, dubbed the Nesha Ramla hominins, date to between 140,000 and 120,000 years ago. The skull characteristics place this population somewhere between Neanderthals and modern humans. Their jaws were robust, resembling early Neanderthals in some ways, while their other features remained distinctly archaic. These remains may represent a population that lived in the Levant for hundreds of thousands of years, interacting with and possibly interbreeding with both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens. The researchers believed that humans from this group may have migrated westward into Europe, eventually contributing to the Neanderthal populations we find there, and eastward into Asia as well. The Middle East was not just a corridor between continents. It was a meeting place where different branches of the human family came together, shared ideas, and possibly shared genes. 100,000 years ago, Neanderthals appear to have been the most common form of human in the Middle East. Remains from numerous caves throughout the region show that they were engaging in surprisingly complex behaviours. They buried their dead sometimes in flexed positions with the knees drawn up to the chest. They used red ochre for purposes that remain unclear but may have been symbolic. They were not the dim brutes of popular imagination. They were people with their own traditions and perhaps their own spiritual lives. What makes this even more fascinating is what was happening far to the east, where the Neanderthals never reached. Other kinds of humans had been living in Asia for as much as 2 million years, adapting to environments ranging from tropical forests to high mountain ranges to remote islands. These conditions produced a diverse array of human relatives, each following their own evolutionary path. To the northeast, in a cave perched in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, lived a population that has captured enormous public attention in recent years. The Denisovans, named after the cave where their remains were first identified, share that remote shelter with some of the most extraordinary discoveries in paleoanthropology. Among them is a bone fragment from a teenage girl who died around 90,000 years ago. Researchers affectionately call her Deni, and her story is unlike anything else in the human fossil record. Deni was a hybrid. Her mother was a Neanderthal and her father was a Denisovan. She represents the only first-generation hybrid between two distinct human species ever discovered. The fact that we found her at all, given how few ancient human remains have yielded DNA, suggests that such interbreeding may have been relatively common whenever these populations encountered each other. Neanderthals and Denisovans may not have had many opportunities to meet, but when they did, they clearly did not see each other as different species. They saw each other as potential partners. Deni lived and died at the furthest eastern edge of the Neanderthal range, and possibly the furthest western edge of Denisovan territory. That cave may represent the point where two great populations overlapped. Unfortunately, we have only a handful of sites with confirmed Denisovan remains. Beyond Denisova Cave itself, only one other location has yielded their DNA, a cave on the Tibetan Plateau in northwest China. The material culture left behind by the Denisovans appears fairly typical for this period. They made large chopping hand axes and relied heavily on wooden spears. But one discovery from northern China hints at something more. The rib of a large mammal was found bearing multiple intersecting lines carefully engraved into its surface. Evidence suggests it was also coated in red ochre pigment. It might not look impressive to modern eyes, but this object is over 100,000 years old. It represents only a fraction of what must have been a much richer symbolic culture that has largely been lost to time. The question of who made this engraved bone remains open. It may have been Denisovans, but it might also have been made by another enigmatic population from the region. A nearly complete skull found in northeast China and named Homo longi shares some similarities with confirmed Denisovan specimens. Some researchers believe Homo longi actually represents the Denisovans. Others argue it is something different entirely. Without genetic confirmation, the mystery remains. Even more intriguing genetic studies of modern human populations in Southeast Asia reveal that people living south of Malaysia carry significantly more Denisovan DNA than other Asian groups. This suggests Denisovans were not just limited to Siberia and the Tibetan Plateau. They were present across a much wider territory, including the tropical islands of Southeast Asia. They would have been living in these regions when our own ancestors arrived expanding out of Africa. We met them, we mingled with them, and then they disappeared. The islands of Southeast Asia also hosted other human species with their own remarkable stories. On the Indonesian island of Flores there lived what may be the strangest member of our entire genus. Homo floresiensis stood only about 1 meter tall as an adult. A fully grown individual would have weighed around 35 kilograms and possessed a brain roughly the size of a grapefruit. When their remains were first discovered in 2003, they were immediately nicknamed the Hobbits, after the diminutive characters from Tolkien novels. These tiny humans are thought to have evolved their small stature through a process called island dwarfism. When large animals become isolated on islands with limited resources and few predators, evolution often favors smaller body sizes. You need less food to survive when you're small. The same process affected other animals on Flores. The island was home to dwarf elephants called stegodon, whose remains show up alongside Homo floresiensis tools. Despite their tiny brains, these hobbits lived in remarkably similar ways to other humans. They made stone tools, including flakes points and blades. They hunted the juvenile stegodon, and the remains of these small elephants show butchery marks from where the meat was removed. They also contended with predators that seem pulled from fantasy. Flores was home to giant rats, large monitor lizards, and a massive stork that stood nearly 2 meters tall. The Komodo dragon still lives on nearby islands today, and its ancestors shared the landscape with Homo floresiensis. Try to imagine the daily lives of these people, one day feasting on the meat of a dwarf elephant, the next watching helplessly as a giant dragon carries off one of their own. It sounds like something from science fiction, but this place existed for hundreds of thousands of years. Then our species showed up and presumably changed everything. The hobbits vanish from the fossil record around 50,000 years ago, right around the time Homo sapiens arrived on the island. The last species we know was walking the earth 100,000 years ago takes us to another remote island in the Philippines. Homo luzonensis was discovered in Calao Cave on the island of Luzon. Their remains are fragmentary, consisting mainly of teeth, finger bones, toe bones, and a piece of femur. DNA extraction has failed so far, but what the bones reveal is fascinating. The teeth display a strange mixture of features, some looking surprisingly modern, and others resembling the much more ancient Australopithecus. The curved finger and toe bones suggest climbing may have been important to these people, hinting at a lifestyle quite different from our own. Researchers initially estimated these fossils to be around 67,000 years old, though more recent analysis suggests they may actually be much older, perhaps 130,000 years or more. What makes Homo luzonensis particularly remarkable is that Luzon has always been an island separated from the Asian mainland by deep water. Reaching it would have required a substantial sea crossing over what is called the Huxley Line. This implies that whoever the ancestors of Homo luzonensis were, they possessed at least basic seafaring technology. They could cross open ocean. That is not a trivial achievement for any human population, let alone one with such unusual anatomical features. The world 100,000 years ago was a diverse place filled with isolated populations, each following their own evolutionary path. In Africa, our species was clearly advancing in profound ways, creating complex technology, symbolic objects and art. But we were not the only ones doing amazing things. The Neanderthals in the heart of Europe were in many ways our equals, creating their own complex tools and engaging in behaviours that defy simple explanation. In the far reaches of Asia, mysterious populations like the Denisovans left traces we're only beginning to understand. On remote tropical islands, tiny humans like Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis lived lives so alien to our experience that they challenge our very conception of what it means to be human. All of these populations would eventually disappear, leaving only our species behind. But 100,000 years ago, the future was uncertain, and the Earth belonged to many kinds of people. The next decade of research will undoubtedly reveal much more about this extraordinary period. New discoveries will reshape our understanding of how these different human populations lived, interacted, and ultimately what happened when they encountered each other. For now, we can only marvel at the glimpses we have caught of a world that was far more complex and far more human than anyone previously imagined. But if we really want to understand what was happening 100,000 years ago, we need to look more closely at the species that gets the worst reputation in all of human prehistory. And we need to completely rethink everything we thought we knew about them. The Neanderthals get a bad reputation. For decades they were portrayed as hunched-over brutes barely capable of thought, shuffling through Ice Age Europe until our ancestors showed up and outcompeted them. That image could not be more wrong. When you actually look at what they left behind, the picture that emerges is of people who are doing things every bit as strange and wonderful as anything our own species was up to. Consider what was found deep inside Bruniquel Cave in southwestern France. About 176,000 years ago, somebody went far into the darkness of this cave, not just a little way in, but over 300 meters from the entrance. That is longer than 3 football fields of absolute pitch-black darkness. They would have needed fire to see where they were going, and once they reached a particular spot, they did something nobody can fully explain. They broke off hundreds of stalagmites from the cave floor and arranged them into 2 large ring-shaped structures. Some of the broken pieces were stacked on top of each other. Many showed signs of being burned. Nobody knows why they did this. The rings are too far from the entrance to have served as living space. There are no animal bones suggesting hunting or food preparation. No tools, no trash. Just these strange, carefully built circles of stone deep underground where no sunlight has ever reached. The effort required to carry fire that deep into a cave and spend hours arranging heavy stone formations suggests this was not some random act. It was deliberate, it had purpose, and it was done by Neanderthals more than 100,000 years before our species even arrived in Europe. Let that sink in for a second. This kind of behaviour does not fit the old image of Neanderthals at all. Neither does what was found at a site called Krapina in Croatia. There, among Neanderthal remains dating to around 130,000 years ago, researchers discovered eagle talons that had been modified. The claws showed polish marks and cut marks in places that only make sense if they were being strung together. 8 talons from white-tailed eagles were collected and worked into what appears to be a necklace or bracelet. Think about that for a second. These people were not just surviving, they were catching eagles, which is not easy. They were carefully removing the talons, they were polishing them and stringing them together to wear. This is decoration. This is personal adornment. This is exactly the kind of behaviour we associate with modern humans, but here are Neanderthals doing it well over 100,000 years ago. At other sites, we find evidence that Neanderthals modified the remains of their own dead in ways that seem ritualistic. Cut marks on skulls suggest defleshing of the deceased. Whether this represents cannibalism, burial preparation, or something else entirely remains unknown. But the pattern shows up repeatedly across different sites in different time periods. Whatever they were doing with their dead, it was not random. When it comes to food, Neanderthals were far more flexible than the mammoth hunters of popular imagination. Sure, they took down big game when they could. Mammoth remains with butchery marks prove that. But they also gathered shellfish along coastlines. They ate mushrooms and plants. At some sites, fish bones show up in their living areas. They were generalists adapting their diet to whatever their environment offered. Coastal Neanderthals ate differently than those living in forests or on open plains. All of this points to people who were thinking, planning, and creating meaning in their lives. They were not just reacting to the world around them. They were shaping it according to ideas that existed only in their minds. And 100,000 years ago they were doing all of this across a huge territory, stretching from the Atlantic coast of Europe through the Middle East and possibly beyond. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, a completely different human culture was flourishing. In North Africa, from modern-day Morocco all the way to Egypt and south, into what is now the Sahara Desert, the Aterian people were developing their own distinctive way of life. This culture first appears around 150,000 years ago and persisted in some areas until roughly 20,000 years ago. That is over 100,000 years of continuous cultural tradition, which is almost impossible to wrap your head around. The Aterian are best known for a particular style of stone tool. They made points with a narrow stem or tang at the base. This tang allowed the point to be attached to a wooden shaft much more securely than the points other cultures were making at the time. You could bind the tang into a split stick and it would hold firm even on impact. This seems like a simple innovation, but it changed everything about how these tools could be used. The small size of many Aterian points suggests they were probably attached to throwing spears, or maybe even to darts launched from spear throwers. A spear thrower is basically a stick with a hook on one end that lets you hurl a light dart much faster and farther than you could throw it by hand. We do not have direct evidence of spear throwers from this period because wood rarely survives for tens of thousands of years. But the points themselves hint at projectile technology that was pretty advanced for its time. With their toolkit, the Aterian hunted everything the North African landscape had to offer. Antelope and gazelle were common prey. Buffalo showed up in their camps. They even took down rhinoceros and elephant. These were not people scraping by on the edge of survival. They were apex predators controlling their environment and exploiting it systematically, and they were connected to each other across vast distances. At some Aterian sites, researchers have found shell beads made from species that only live in the ocean. These beads turn up hundreds of kilometers inland. Somebody had to carry them there or trade for them. Other materials like high-quality stone for tool making were transported up to 300 kilometers from their sources. This tells us these people were not isolated bands wandering randomly. They had networks. They had relationships with other groups. They were exchanging goods and probably ideas across distances that would take weeks to walk. The landscape they lived in looked nothing like the Sahara of today. 100,000 years ago, North Africa was wet. Lakes filled basins that are now bone dry. Rivers flowed where there is only sand. Grasslands and forests covered territory that camels now struggle to cross. This was the Green Sahara, and it supported human populations across areas that are completely uninhabitable today. When we look at all of this together, a picture starts to form. The world 100,000 years ago was not empty, waiting for modern humans to fill it with culture and meaning. It was already full. Full of different human populations, each with their own traditions, technologies, and ways of understanding the world. The Neanderthals were making mysterious constructions in caves and wearing eagle talons around their necks. The Aterian people were trading shell beads across hundreds of kilometers of savanna. Our own ancestors were creating art toolkits and burying their dead with care. but all of these populations were still largely confined to their own territories. The Neanderthals dominated Europe and stretched into the Middle East. The Aterian flourished across North Africa. Our species was mostly concentrated in eastern and southern Africa, with some populations beginning to establish themselves in the Levant. What would eventually bring all of these worlds into contact was already beginning, but it would take tens of thousands more years to fully unfold. In the Levant, a handful of caves preserve evidence of just how complex the human situation was in this region. At sites called Skul and Kafze, both located in modern Israel, researchers have found remains of early Homo sapiens dating back around 100,000 years. These were not the first of our species to reach the area. That jawbone from nearly 200,000 years ago proves we had been coming and going for a long time. But the Skul and Kafse people left behind more than just bones. They buried their dead. At Kafse, one burial contained a young woman with a child placed at her feet. Another individual was buried with deer antlers laid across their body. Red ochre shows up in several graves. These burials look a lot like what Neanderthals were doing in the same region during the same time period. Were they learning from each other, developing similar practices independently? Or was burial just something that both species came to on their own because it addressed a need that all humans feel? The shell beads from these sites are also telling. Perforated shells, some from species found only along the coast, appear in graves and living areas. Somebody was collecting these shells, drilling holes in them, and wearing them as ornaments. The practice shows up in Homo sapien sites and Neanderthal sites across the region. Either both groups came up with the same idea, or they were sharing it somehow. This brings up a question that has puzzled researchers for years. When different human species encountered each other, what happened? We know from genetics that they sometimes had children together. Neanderthal DNA shows up in everyone outside of Africa today. Denisovan DNA is concentrated in certain populations, especially in Melanesia and Australia. These were not rare one-time events. They happened repeatedly over thousands of years across thousands of kilometers. But beyond the genetics, what did these encounters look like? Did groups fight over territory? Did they trade? Did they teach each other new techniques? The archaeological evidence suggests the answer to all of these questions might be yes. Toolmaking traditions that look distinctly Homo sapiens appear at sites with Neanderthal remains. Technologies that seem Neanderthal in origin show up in early modern human assemblages. The boundaries between these populations were not walls. They were more like membranes allowing things to pass through. Across Asia, the situation was even more complicated. Populations that scientists have struggled to classify lived alongside Denisovans, and possibly other groups we've not yet identified. On the island of Java, remains traditionally classified as Homo erectus seem to have persisted far longer than they did anywhere else. Some researchers think these late surviving erectus populations might actually be something else entirely. The Solo Man remains from the Solo River have been dated to as recently as 50,000 years ago, though the exact dates remain controversial. What we do know is that Asia was not empty when our species arrived. Multiple human populations had been adapting to these environments for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. Some had shrunk on islands, others had spread across mainland territories larger than most countries today. A few had figured out how to cross open ocean, and all of them would eventually encounter the expanding wave of Homo sapiens pushing out of Africa. Life for any of these ancient people would have been utterly alien to us. There were no governments, no writing, no agriculture. Everything they knew about the world came from direct experience or from what their elders taught them. A successful hunt meant the difference between eating well and going hungry. A serious injury could mean death. Disease swept through populations without any understanding of what caused it or how to treat it. And yet within these constraints they created meaning. They made beautiful tools when ugly ones would have worked just as well. They decorated themselves with beads and ochre. They built structures that served no obvious practical purpose. They buried their dead instead of leaving them for scavengers. All the things we think make us special were already present in some form 100,000 years ago, distributed across multiple species on multiple continents. The coastal regions of Africa during this period probably supported some of the densest human populations. The ocean provided a reliable source of protein. Shellfish could be gathered without much risk. Fish could be caught with nets or traps or spears. The moderate climate meant you did not need much in the way of shelter or clothing. Life along these shores might have been relatively comfortable by the standards of the time. Inland, the picture varied wildly depending on where you were. The wet conditions across the Sahara meant some inland populations had access to lakes and rivers full of fish. Others lived in woodlands hunting forest game. On the open savannas, people followed herds of grazing animals moving with the seasons. Each of these lifestyles required different tools, different knowledge, different ways of organizing groups. What tied them all together was fire. Every human population from Homo erectus onward used fire. They cooked their food, which made it easier to digest and killed parasites and bacteria. They kept warm during cold nights. They used smoke to preserve meat and drive away insects. Fire probably also structured social life. Sitting around a fire at night, telling stories, sharing information, planning for tomorrow. All of that would have been part of daily existence for 100,000 years and more before that. When the sun went down, the world became genuinely dangerous. Large predators were far more common then than now. Lions, leopards, hyenas, and other carnivores saw humans as potential prey. Fire kept them at bay. Sleeping near a fire with other people watching in shifts was probably how most nights went. The darkness held real terrors, and light was the only protection. Children born into these worlds learned everything they needed to know from watching and imitating. There were no schools, no books, no videos. If your mother knew how to make a particular kind of tool, you might learn it from her. If your father knew where certain plants grew, you might remember those places your whole life. Knowledge passed directly from mind to mind through demonstration and practice. Anything that was not passed on was lost forever. This is why technological change was so slow. Innovations could easily die with the innovator. A brilliant idea that was not shared widely enough might disappear when its inventor did. The accumulated knowledge of humanity grew not through deliberate progress, but through the slow accumulation of tiny improvements that happened to stick. Most new ideas failed. A few survived long enough to spread, and once in a while something truly transformative took hold and changed everything. The period around 100,000 years ago seems to have been one of those transformative moments. Across Africa and parts of the Middle East, human populations were developing new tools, new ways of expressing themselves and new ways of treating their dead. Similar changes may have been happening among Neanderthals in Europe and possibly among other populations in Asia. Something was shifting in how humans engaged with the world. Whether this shift was driven by genetic changes in the brain, by population growth that created more opportunities for innovation, or by climate changes that forced people to adapt remains unclear. Probably all of these factors played a role. What matters is that by 100,000 years ago, the foundations were being laid for everything that would come after. The symbolic thinking, the complex technology, the social networks that could span hundreds of kilometers. All of it was emerging from the deep past, pointing toward a future that none of these ancient people could have imagined. To really understand how these people live day to day, we need to look at the places where evidence survived in extraordinary detail. And there is no better place to start than a series of caves perched on the wild southern coast of Africa, where people returned again and again for over 70,000 years. Along the Tsitsikamma coast of South Africa, where cliffs drop into the churning waters of the Indian Ocean, sits a series of caves that people occupied continuously for over 70,000 years. Clayses River has become one of the most important windows into the lives of early modern humans, and the remains found there tell us things about our ancestors that bones and tools alone could never reveal. The deposits at Clayses run 20 meters deep, layer after layer of accumulated debris from tens of thousands of years of human activity. Shell middens pile on top of each other, showing that generation after generation these people harvested the ocean. Fish bones appear throughout the sequence, deposited partly by human hands and partly by cormorants that roosted in the same shelters. The caves were never permanent homes. Groups would stay for a few weeks, exploiting the abundant marine resources, then move on to follow seasonal patterns of game and plant foods. Then they would return again the next year and the next. What makes Clayses particularly striking is what was found in the hearths. Researchers recently discovered charred remains of starchy plant foods preserved in the ash. Tubers and rhizomes that people dug from the ground, roasted in the fire and ate. This evidence dates back to around 120,000 years ago, making it some of the earliest proof that our ancestors were cooking and eating starches. They understood that certain roots become edible and nutritious when heated. They knew where to find these plants and when to harvest them. This was not random foraging. It was systematic knowledge passed from parent to child over countless generations. The human remains from Clayses tell their own strange story. Skull fragments and jaw bones from several individuals were found scattered through the deposits. Unlike the careful burials seen at other sites, these bones show evidence of processing. Cut marks suggest defleshing. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of cannibalism, whether ritualistic or nutritional remains unclear. Others think it might represent a form of secondary burial, where the dead were exposed until the flesh was gone and then the bones were collected and stored. Whatever the truth, these were not casual deaths left where they fell. Something deliberate was happening with human remains at this place. The anatomy of these people is fascinating in its own right. One foot bone recovered from the site belonged to someone remarkably large. Sexual dimorphism was pronounced in these early populations, meaning males were considerably bigger than females, more so than in most modern human groups. The finger bones found at the site are small and gracile, unlike the robust bones of Neanderthals. In many ways, these hands would not look out of place on a person today. About 70,000 years ago, a shift appears in the stone tool technology at Clayses. The Howison's port industry, as it is called, produced small-backed blades quite different from the larger points that came before. These blades were made from stone imported from sources 20 kilometers inland. Somebody walked that distance, carried the raw material back, and crafted these distinctive tools from it. The effort involved suggests these blades had value beyond their immediate utility. After a few thousand years, this industry disappeared and older styles returned. Why this happened, nobody knows. Cultures rise and fall. techniques are invented, then forgotten. Progress is not a straight line. Further north in the Blombos Mountains, another cave tells an equally remarkable story. Border Cave sits high on a cliff face looking out over the lowlands of what is now Eswatini. People lived here on and off for over 200,000 years, making it one of the longest continuous records of human occupation anywhere on Earth. The preservation at this site is exceptional because of the dry conditions. Things that would have rotted away almost anywhere else survived here in recognizable form. In 2020, researchers announced they had found evidence of grass bedding at Border Cave, dating back roughly 200,000 years. The grasses belong to the Panicoidea family species that still grow in the region today. These were not just random plant materials blown in by wind. The quantities and the way they were layered show deliberate placement. People were gathering armfuls of grass and spreading it on the cave floor to create comfortable sleeping and working surfaces. Even more telling was what they found mixed with the grass. Layers of ash separated the bedding episodes. The pattern suggests people periodically burned their old bedding, perhaps to get rid of pests or smell, and then laid fresh grass on top of the ash. Among the plant remains were traces of camphor bush, a species still used in parts of Africa as an insect repellent. The people living in Border Cave 200,000 years ago appear to have known that certain aromatic plants could keep bugs away. They used ash, which blocks the breathing apparatus of crawling insects like ticks and lice. This was not accidental. This was pest control. Think about what this implies. These people understood that ticks carried in on their bodies or attracted by the warmth of their sleeping places could be driven off by sleeping on ash. They recognized that specific plants had properties useful for something other than eating. They gathered these materials and combined them for a desired effect. This is not instinct. This is learned behavior passed down through teaching and observation. This is culture in its truest sense. Other discoveries at Border Cave push back the timeline on various human behaviors even further. Evidence shows that giant land snails were systematically collected, roasted in fires, and eaten starting around 170,000 years ago. The shells show heat damage consistent with cooking. This was not occasional scavenging, but a regular part of the diet. Snails are slow-moving and abundant. Collecting them requires no special tools or hunting skill, but recognizing them as food and knowing to cook them first that takes accumulated knowledge. What did daily life actually look like for these people? Forget everything movies have shown you. There were no grunting cavemen dragging women by the hair. These were sophisticated people living in a world that would terrify us. They lived in small groups, maybe 20 to 50 individuals. Everyone knew everyone else their whole lives. There were no strangers. The old man by the fire had walked this land for decades and knew things about it you could not learn any other way. The woman knapping stone tools had learned from her mother, who learned from her mother, stretching back further than anyone could count. Children learned by watching. There were no schools, no books, no videos. If your mother knew how to identify a poisonous plant from an edible one, you might learn it, or you might not, and then you might die. Knowledge was survival. Ignorance was often death. The division of labor was nothing like what most people imagine. Sure, men did more hunting and women did more gathering, but the lines blurred constantly. Women joined communal hunts. Men collected plant foods when convenient. Everyone did what needed doing. The rigid roles we assume existed are more our projection than their reality. Movement was constant. not daily wandering but seasonal circuits that followed the availability of resources. When shellfish were abundant along the coast, people moved there. When certain fruits ripened inland, they relocated. When game animals migrated, people followed. This was not random drifting, but purposeful travel along routes their ancestors had walked for generations. They knew exactly where they were going and why. At regular intervals, perhaps annually or less frequently, bands would gather with other bands. These aggregations might bring together 100 or more people for brief periods. Marriages would be arranged, news would be shared, disputes would be settled. Young people would meet potential partners from outside their immediate kin group. Then everyone would disperse again, returning to their normal small band existence until the next gathering. These larger social connections mattered enormously. Shell beads found hundreds of kilometers from the nearest coast prove that objects moved between groups. Whether through direct travel or through chains of trade, goods passed from hand to hand across vast distances. A string of beads made on the Atlantic shore might end up on someone living in the interior highlands. The networks that allowed this movement also allowed ideas to spread. A new technique discovered in one place could eventually reach people very far away. The climate during this period shaped everything. Around 125,000 years ago, the world was in what scientists call the last interglacial, a warm period between ice ages. Global temperatures were about 1.5 degrees warmer than today on average. Sea levels were slightly higher. Polar ice was reduced. In Africa, the effects were dramatic. The Sahara, which we think of as the ultimate desert, was periodically green during this time. Not continuously, but in cycles linked to changes in Earth's orbit around the Sun. When conditions aligned, monsoon rains pushed further north. Rivers flowed through territory that is now bone dry. Lakes filled basins that today hold nothing but sand. Grasslands and even some forests covered regions that no plants can survive in now. Human populations spread into these newly habitable zones and retreated when the rains failed. Further south, in what is now South Africa, conditions were different. The Southern Cape had a climate somewhat similar to today, though perhaps slightly wetter. The big difference was what lay offshore. During warm periods like the last interglacial, sea levels were high and the coastline sat close to where it is now. But during glacial periods, when water was locked up in ice sheets, sea levels dropped dramatically, sometimes by more than 100 meters. When that happened, vast stretches of what is now ocean floor became dry land. The continental shelf off southern Africa exposed a plain that extended up to 100 kilometers beyond the current shore. This territory is called the Paleo-Agulhas Plain, and during glacial periods it would have been prime habitat for both animals and humans. We cannot excavate these sites because they are underwater now, but we know people must have lived there. The coastal caves that preserve so much evidence represent only the very edge of what would have been a much larger inhabited landscape. For people living along these prehistoric shores, the ocean provided more than just food. The predictability of marine resources may have allowed populations to become denser than they could be inland. Shellfish are abundant and relatively easy to collect. They do not run away. They do not fight back. A person could gather enough in a few hours to feed themselves and their family. This security may have given coastal populations more time for other activities, including the symbolic behaviours that start appearing in the archaeological record around this period. The first direct evidence that our ancestors were systematically exploiting marine resources comes from Pinnacle Point, where deposits dating to about 164,000 years ago contained shells from mollusks that people collected and ate. These were not random finds. They represent deliberate, systematic harvesting. The people knew where to find shellfish. They knew when the tides were right for collecting. This requires understanding lunar cycles and tidal patterns. It requires planning and memory. It requires passing on information from those who know to those who are still learning. Disease was a constant companion, though people understood nothing of its causes. Infections that modern antibiotics cure in days were death sentences. A cut that became septic could kill. Childbirth was dangerous for mothers and infants alike. Infant mortality was high. Life expectancy at birth was probably around 30 years, though those who survived childhood could live much longer. Old age was relative. Someone in their 50s would have been considered ancient. Injuries from hunting were common. Getting close enough to large animals to kill them with wooden spears was inherently dangerous. Animals fight back. They kick and gore and bite. Bones from prehistoric humans show healed fractures and other injuries consistent with violent encounters. Some people survived terrible wounds, others did not. The margin between life and death was narrow. Despite all of this hardship, there was also joy. Children played. Couples formed bonds. Elders were valued for their knowledge. People decorated themselves with beads and ochre. They gathered around fires and almost certainly told stories, even if we can never know what those stories were. They experienced the same range of emotions we do today. They grieved their dead. They celebrated births. They feared the unknown. They wondered at the stars. The world they inhabited was not empty wilderness waiting to be filled. It was their home, and they knew it intimately. Every hill and valley had meaning. Every water source had a name. Animals were not just prey, but actors in a shared landscape whose behaviors were understood in detail. Plants were not just food, but medicine and poison, and material for tools and shelter. This was not a lesser form of existence. It was a different form shaped by different constraints, but no less rich or meaningful than our own. By 100,000 years ago, the foundations of modern humanity were firmly in place. People who looked like us and thought like us were living complex lives across multiple continents. They made beautiful objects. They cared for their sick and their elderly. They buried their dead. They traded over long distances. They adapted to environments ranging from tropical coasts to cold highlands. They were fully human in every way that matters. What had not yet happened was the explosion. The population boom that would eventually send humans to every corner of the globe. The technological acceleration that would lead from stone tools to spacecraft in a geological instant. All of that lay in the future, hidden beyond the horizon of what anyone living then could possibly have imagined. They had no idea what was coming. How could they? They were too busy surviving and sometimes thriving in the only world they knew. But there is one aspect of their lives we've not examined closely enough: the sheer intelligence required for what they were doing. When you look at the technical skill needed to make some of their tools, it changes everything you thought you knew about prehistoric minds. And nowhere is this more obvious than in a cave overlooking a river in what is now KwaZulu-Natal. North of Durban, in the rolling hills of KwaZulu-Natal, sits a cave that changed how we think about prehistoric intelligence. Sibudu Cave overlooks the Tongati River from a sandstone cliff, and for tens of thousands of years people sheltered within its walls. What they left behind tells us that ancient humans were not just smart, they were chemists, and I mean that literally. Around 70,000 years ago, somebody at Symbolism did something that still impresses material scientists today. They took plant gum collected from acacia trees and mixed it with powdered red ochre. They may have added small amounts of beeswax or animal fat to improve the consistency. Then they heated this mixture over a fire, being careful not to boil it or let it dry out too much. The result was a compound adhesive strong enough to attach a stone point to a wooden shaft, creating a weapon that would hold together through the violence of a hunt. This sounds simple until you try it yourself. Modern researchers have attempted to replicate this process using only materials and methods available to people living 70,000 years ago. Most of them failed, repeatedly. The person making this glue had to understand that plant gum alone was too sticky and too weak. They had to know that ochre would change its properties, making it stronger and more workable. They had to recognize that the mixture needed heat to bind properly, but that too much heat would ruin it. They had to hold all of these variables in their mind, simultaneously adjusting as they went, based on how the mixture looked and felt. Modern researchers have tried to replicate this process using only materials and methods available to people living 70,000 years ago. What they found surprised them. The acacia gum varies depending on which tree it comes from and what time of year you collect it. Its stickiness and acidity fluctuate. The ochre varies too, with different iron oxide content depending on where you dig it up. There is no single recipe that always works. You have to adapt, constantly making decisions based on subtle cues that take experience to recognize. The scientists who studied this concluded that making compound adhesive required mental abilities we typically associate only with modern humans. Abstract thinking, multitasking, the capacity to plan several steps ahead while monitoring what is happening right now. The ability to understand that invisible properties like acidity affect how things behave. All of this was happening in Africa 70,000 years ago, among people whose daily survival depended on getting it right. But here is what really catches the attention. Different recipes show up in different layers at Symbolism. Sometimes the adhesive contains plant gum and ochre. Sometimes it contains gum and fat, but no ochre. Sometimes the proportions vary. This means either different groups with different traditions occupied the cave at different times, or the same group experimented with multiple approaches. Either way, it shows flexibility and creativity in problem solving. The weapons these adhesives held together were serious hunting tools. Use-wear analysis on the stone points reveals damage patterns consistent with being thrown or thrust into animals. Some researchers believe the smallest points may have been attached to arrows rather than spears. If that is true, it would push back the origin of bow and arrow technology by tens of thousands of years. Regardless of what propelled them, these were hafted weapons. Stone blades attached to wooden handles, composite tools that combined different materials into something more effective than any single material could be on its own. Around the same time, in another part of South Africa, people were doing something completely different but equally revealing. At Deep Kloof Rock Shelter near the Atlantic coast, archaeologists have recovered over 270 fragments of engraved ostrich eggshell. These pieces date to around 60,000 years ago, and they represent something unprecedented. The earliest evidence of a graphic tradition among prehistoric humans. Ostrich eggs are large things capable of holding about a litre of liquid. People used them as water containers, carrying precious drinking water across the landscape. But the people at Deep Kloof did not just use these containers, they decorated them. Using sharp stone tools, they engraved patterns into the eggshell surfaces. Cross-hatched lines forming band motifs, parallel lines running together, geometric patterns that repeat with variations. The fragments come from at least 25 separate containers spread across 18 different layers at the site spanning several thousand years. This was not one person doing something once. This was a tradition maintained across generations, mothers showing daughters how to make the patterns themselves changing over time with different motifs appearing in earlier layers than in later ones. What were these engravings for? Some researchers think they marked identity. This is my container, or perhaps this is our group's container. Among modern hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari ostrich egg flasks are still used, and they are often decorated with designs that identify their owners or the groups those owners belong to. The prehistoric engravers at Deep Kloof may have been doing something similar, using visual symbols to communicate belonging. The patterns follow rules. They are not random scratches. Whoever made them had an idea in their head of what the design should look like and then executed that idea on the shell surface. This requires the capacity to hold an abstract concept and translate it into physical action. It requires understanding that marks can carry meaning beyond themselves, that a hatched line is not just a hatched line but a signal about who you are and where you come from. This brings up one of the biggest questions about ancient humans. Could they talk? The evidence suggests they almost certainly could, though we can never prove it directly. A gene called FOXP2 plays a crucial role in language development. When it is mutated in modern humans, the result is severe difficulty with speech and language comprehension. The interesting thing is that Neanderthals had the same version of this gene that we do. So did Denisovans. This means the human variant arose at least 300,000 or 400,000 years ago, before our lineage split from theirs. Having the gene does not guarantee full language ability. There are probably many genes involved and we do not know what all of them do. But it suggests that the biological capacity for complex vocal communication is old, very old. By 100,000 years ago, the people living in Africa almost certainly had language of some kind. Words for things, ways of describing the past and planning for the future. Stories told around fires that taught children what they needed to know. We cannot hear those words. They vanished the moment they were spoken, leaving no trace in the archaeological record. But we can see their effects. The compound adhesives at Sibudu could not have been developed or transmitted without detailed verbal instruction. The geometric traditions at Deep Kloof required shared conventions that had to be communicated somehow. The long-distance trade networks that moved shell beads hundreds of kilometers only work if people can negotiate and explain and agree. Language changes everything. It allows knowledge to be passed on without the learner having to figure everything out from scratch. It lets one generation build on what the previous generation knew. It makes possible the kind of cumulative culture that eventually leads to computers and spacecraft and all the rest. Somewhere in the deep past, humans crossed the threshold from simple animal communication into true language. By 100,000 years ago, they had crossed it. But here is something strange about the archaeological record from this period. Innovations appear, then disappear, then appear again. The shell beads at some sites are absent from later layers that otherwise show occupation. Bone tools come and go. Decorative traditions flourish, then fade. This pattern has puzzled researchers for decades. Why would people who clearly could do something stop doing it? One possibility is that we are looking at different populations moving through the same places at different times. Group A uses shell beads. Group B does not. When Group B occupies a cave previously used by Group A, the bead tradition disappears from the record at that location, even though Group A might still be making beads somewhere else. Another possibility involves population crashes. Genetic evidence suggests that human populations went through severe bottlenecks during this period. Climate shifts or disease or some other disaster may have reduced the number of living humans to just a few thousand individuals. When populations collapse like that, knowledge can be lost. If the people who knew how to make a particular tool or decoration all die without passing on their skills, that tradition dies with them. This is one of the most important things to understand about prehistoric progress. It was not a steady march forward. Brilliant innovations could emerge and spread, and then disappear completely, only to be reinvented thousands of years later, or never reinvented at all. The accumulated knowledge of any group hung by a thread. One bad winter, one epidemic, one generation that failed to teach the next. That was all it took to erase centuries of hard-won learning. The people living 100,000 years ago had no way to record their knowledge permanently. No writing, no drawings detailed enough to serve as instruction manuals. Everything they knew existed only in living minds and passed only through living voices and demonstrating hands. When those minds fell silent and those hands went still, whatever they had held went with them. This makes the achievements we can still see even more remarkable. The ochre toolkit at Blombos survived in the archaeological record as physical objects, but the understanding required to use it properly must have been maintained through teaching and learning generation after generation for thousands of years. The adhesive tradition at Symbolism required not just the knowledge of how to mix the ingredients, but the skill to judge when the mixture was right. You cannot learn that from looking at a finished tool. Someone has to show you. Consider what it means to teach someone how to make compound adhesive using only demonstration and spoken language. You have to explain that the gum from this tree works, but the gum from that tree does not. You have to show how to grind the ochre fine enough. You have to describe what the mixture should look like at each stage of heating. You have to warn about the mistakes that ruin the batch. All of this while the learner watches and listens and tries to remember every detail because there will be no second chance to hear it. The patience required for this kind of teaching is immense. The attention required for this kind of learning equally so, yet it must have happened constantly in these ancient communities. Children watching adults, adolescents practicing under supervision, young adults eventually taking over the teaching role themselves, the chain of knowledge linking one mind to the next, stretching back into a past no one alive could remember. What we see in the archaeological record is only what survived. Stone tools last essentially forever under the right conditions. Bone can last, shell can last, ochre leaves stains that endure. But so much else is gone. Wooden tools rotted away. Plant fibre bags and baskets decomposed. Clothing, if they wore any, vanished without a trace. The songs, the stories, the names, the beliefs, the fears, the jokes, all of it gone. We are looking at the ancient world through the tiniest keyhole, seeing only hints of what was actually there. The people who made these things were not primitive versions of us waiting to become fully human. They were fully human already. Their brains were our brains. Their emotions were our emotions. They loved their children. They mourned their dead. They wondered about the stars and the seasons and why some years brought plenty while others brought hunger. They had personalities. Some were kind. Some were cruel, some were curious, some were cautious. They were individuals, not categories. The world they inhabited would be unrecognizable to us in some ways, and strangely familiar in others. No cities, No farms, no domesticated animals except maybe dogs, though, that came later. But also sunsets and rainstorms and the sound of wind in grass, the warmth of fire on cold nights, the satisfaction of a meal after a successful hunt, the comfort of sleeping near people you have known your whole life. The basics of human experience have not changed, even if everything around them has. 100,000 years ago, multiple human species shared this planet. Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, hobbits on remote islands, our own ancestors in Africa and the Middle East. All of them intelligent, all of them creative, all of them adapted to their environments in remarkable ways, and yet today only one species remains. Which raises perhaps the most important question of all. What happened to everyone else? And why are we the ones still here to ask? The question that haunts this entire period is simple. Why us? Why did Homo sapiens survive when Neanderthals did not? When Denisovans vanished? When the hobbits of Flores disappeared? When every other form of human that walked the earth went extinct, leaving only our species to inherit the planet? The answer is not what most people expect. For a long time, the popular explanation involved intelligence. We were smarter. We outcompeted them. We had better technology and superior culture, and they simply could not keep up. This story felt satisfying because it put us at the top where we like to be. But the evidence does not support it. Neanderthals made compound adhesives too. They created art. They buried their dead with care. They survived Ice Age conditions that would have killed us in days. Whatever advantage we had, it was not raw intelligence. Some researchers now think the difference came down to numbers. Our species may have simply produced more children who survived to adulthood. A tiny difference in birth rate or infant survival, compounded over thousands of years, adds up to enormous population imbalances. When resources become scarce, the larger population wins not because any individual is stronger, but because there are more of them competing for what remains. Death by mathematics rather than combat. Others point to social networks. Where Neanderthals operated in small family groups, our ancestors might have maintained connections across wider territories. When food failed in one area, you could move to where your extended network lived. When disease struck, you had a larger population to recover from. Redundancy is survival. Here is what the genetics tell us. Everyone alive today whose ancestors came from outside Africa carries a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. Some populations in Melanesia and Australia carry significant amounts of Denisovan DNA. This means our ancestors did not simply replace these other humans, they absorbed them. Interbreeding was common enough that their genes passed into our lineage and remain there today. Think about what that implies. Somewhere in the distant past, a Homo sapiens and a Neanderthal had a child together. That child grew up and had children of their own. Those children had children. The line continued unbroken down through the ages until eventually one of those descendants was born who became one of your ancestors. The Neanderthals are not entirely gone. Fragments of them survive in the cells of billions of living people. So do fragments of Denisovans. So possibly do fragments of other human species we have not yet identified. What happened to the other populations when our ancestors expanded? The honest answer is we do not entirely know. Some were absorbed through interbreeding. Others may have died from diseases introduced by contact with people whose immune systems had adapted to different pathogens. Competition for resources played a role, especially when climate shifted and livable territory shrank. Violence probably happened too. The extinction of the Neanderthals was not a single event. but a long, slow fade that played out across tens of thousands of years and thousands of kilometers. This same was true for every other human species. They did not fall in battle. They simply stopped existing. We will probably never know who the last Neanderthal was. When she died, whether she had any sense that her people were vanishing, the world that emerged from this process was emptier in some ways and fuller in others. Only one form of human remained, but that form was spreading everywhere, into territories no human had ever reached, across deserts and mountains and frozen plains, onto islands that required ocean crossings. Our species filled every niche that could support human life. What we're still discovering about this period keeps surprising us. Every few years a new site emerges that pushes back the date of some behavior or technology. Every new genetic study reveals connections we did not suspect. The picture keeps getting more complicated, more interesting, more human. Recent work has shown that innovations we once thought emerged in one place may have developed independently multiple times in different regions. The Southern Cape was not the only centre of the early modern behaviour. Eastern Africa had its own traditions. Northern Africa had others. Intelligence is not rare. The capacity for innovation exists wherever there are smart people solving problems. Given enough time, similar solutions emerge in different places because certain problems have limited good answers. The ancestors who lived 100,000 years ago could not have known any of this. They were not trying to be the starting point of a global species. They were just trying to survive and raise their children and maybe make life a little better than it had been. The long-term consequences of their daily choices were invisible to them. We live in that future now, the world they could not imagine, cities of millions, machines that think, weapons that could end everything they work to build, the potential to leave Earth entirely, all of it built on foundations they laid without knowing it, the fire they tended, the tools they made, the children they taught, the stories they told. Everything connects back eventually to people sitting in caves, looking at the same stars we see today. What would they think if they could see us now? Pride, perhaps, at how far their descendants have come. Horror, maybe, at what we've done to the planet. Confusion, certainly, at the complexity of modern life. Recognition, potentially, at the things that have not changed. We still love our children. We still fear death. We still gather around fire and light to share food and conversation. We still look up at the sky and wonder. When you hold a stone tool made 100,000 years ago, you are holding something a specific person made. Someone with a name, even if we will never know it. Someone with relationships and memories and preferences. Someone who woke up one morning and decided to make this particular object, and did so with hands shaped exactly like yours. The distance in time is vast, but the connection is real. That person was your ancestor. Not metaphorically, actually. The unbroken chain of parent and child that leads to you passes through people who lived exactly this way in Africa 100,000 years ago. Their survival is the reason you exist. You carry pieces of them in your cells. Every challenge they faced and overcame is part of your inheritance. Every meal they found, every predator they escaped. Every winter they survived, every child they raised to adulthood, all of it had to happen exactly as it did, or you would not be here. That is the weight of 100,000 years. That is what it means to be the descendants of people who lived through all of it and somehow kept going. The compound adhesives at Sibudu were just the start of a tradition. that would eventually give us metals and plastics and carbon fibre. The engraved eggshells at Deep Kloof were the first stirrings of what would become writing and art and digital communication. The language they developed became every language ever spoken. The symbolic thinking that let them bury their dead with red ochre eventually let us build cathedrals and write symphonies and send probes to other planets. They could not have imagined where it would all lead. But they set it in motion, and for that alone they deserve to be remembered even if we can never know their names. This is what we know about the world 100,000 years ago. Incomplete, contested, constantly revised as new evidence emerges, but real, based on bones and stones and genes and all the traces that survive from times beyond memory. The people who lived then are not mysteries to be solved, but relatives to be acknowledged. They were human. They struggled and dreamed and died, and somehow, despite everything, they made it possible for us to be here asking about them. That is their legacy. That is our inheritance. That is where we came from.